Hello, it's great to have you here. If you enjoy thrilling romances, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. The wind in the high country of the Arizona Territory spoke a language of its own, a lonely dialect of whispering pines and the sharp scrape of grit against rock. Samuel understood this language better than he did the words of men. For 5 years, it had been his only constant companion, a more honest friend than any he'd known in the life that had been stolen from him. His cabin, nestled in a fold of the Dragoon Mountains, was less a home and more a fortress against memory. Its sturdy pine logs were chiseled with the same grim determination that had carved the deep lines around his eyes. At 34, Samuel had the weathered look of a man a decade older, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, his shoulders broad from swinging a pickaxe and an axe with equal, unforgiving force. He was a ghost, and he knew it. Banished not by law, but by the far more potent verdict of rumor and a powerful man's lie. A stolen payroll, a pointed finger, and the town of dusty, God-fearing folks he'd once tried to belong to had turned on him like a pack of dogs. He hadn't run, he had simply vanished, climbing into the mountains where a man's worth was measured by his resilience, not by the contents of his pockets or the whispers behind his back. Here, he was just Samuel, a prospector chasing the glint of gold in a cold stream, a man who trusted the weight of his Colt peacemaker more than a handshake. His days were a ritual of survival. Check the snares, pan the creek, chop wood, and stare into the fire at night, fighting the ghosts that flickered in the flames. He was hunting this afternoon, not for sport, but for supper. His rifle rested comfortably in the crook of his arm as he moved with a silence born of long practice. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, beating down on the ochre earth and bleaching the life from everything but the hardiest scrub and cactus. He was tracking a buck, its prints sharp in the dry soil, when a different scent hit his nostrils, carried on the hot breeze. It was the coppery tang of blood, and something else, the rank smell of fear. He froze, his keen blue eyes scanning the landscape. It wasn't the buck. This was the smell of a predator's work or a predator's intent. He crested a small rise, his boots making no sound on the gravelly terrain, and looked down into a shallow, sun-baked arroyo. What he saw made the breath catch in his throat. A pack of coyotes, lean and brazen in the afternoon light, were circling. Their movements were a patient, tightening dance of death, and in the center of that circle, propped against a large, flat rock, was a woman, an Apache woman. Her deerskin dress was torn and stained with dirt and blood, her long black hair a tangled curtain hiding part of her face. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and her breathing was a shallow, ragged affair. But she was not screaming. She was not crying. In her hand she clutched a shard of sharp rock, her knuckles white. Her dark eyes, visible through the strands of hair, burned with a defiant fire that the blistering sun could not quench. Samuel's first instinct was a cold, hard knot in his gut. Trouble. This was not his fight. He was an outcast from his own world. He had no place in the violent affairs of another. Bringing an Apache, wounded or not, back to his cabin was an invitation to a different kind of death. Her people would come looking for her, or the cavalry would find her, and either way, questions would be asked that he could not answer. A man living alone in the mountains was a curiosity. A man living with an Apache woman was a target. He should turn, walk away, and let nature take its brutal, indifferent course. It was the smart thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. He watched as the lead coyote, a scarred and mangy beast, took a bold step forward, its lips peeling back in a silent snarl. The woman, Spirit Fawn, did not flinch. She met its yellow eyes with her own, and a low sound, a guttural warning, rumbled in her chest. She remembered the verdict of the elders, poisoned by the lies of Wire. He who had wanted her as his own had twisted her refusal into a curse upon their people. He'd claimed a shadow had fallen over her spirit, that she had brought the sickness to the horses and the drought to the land. His words, slick with envy and rage, had found fertile ground in the soil of fear, and so they had left her, banished, with a broken leg to ensure the sentence was carried out by the spirits of the wilderness. They had left her for the wolves, or, as it turned out, the coyotes. Her spirit, however, refused to be a meal for scavengers. If she was to die, it would be with a weapon in her hand, with a curse on her lips for the warrior who had betrayed her. Samuel saw that unbroken pride. He saw the flicker of defiance in a body that was clearly shutting down, and he saw himself. He saw the same injustice, the same casting out, the same sentence to die alone. His accuser had been a man named Frank, a rancher with a greedy heart and a silver tongue. Hers had been a warrior named Wire. The names were different, the worlds were different, but the poison was the same. A low growl escaped his own throat, an involuntary sound of disgust. Disgust at the coyotes, at the injustice, at his own cowardly hesitation. Before he had even made a conscious decision, his rifle was at his shoulder. The crack of the shot echoed through the canyon, a sharp pronouncement that shattered the afternoon's oppressive silence. The bullet kicked up a puff of dust a foot from the lead coyote's nose. The animal yelped and jumped back, the pack scattering in an instant, melting back into the landscape as if they were never there. Silence descended again, thick and heavy. Spirit Fawn's head snapped up towards the source of the shot. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of shock and suspicion, locked onto the figure of the white man standing on the rise. He was tall and broad, a silhouette against the blinding sun, the rifle held with an easy familiarity. He was not a soldier. His clothes were the worn denim and faded flannel of a working man, but he was still a Ndé, a white-eyed enemy. Her hand tightened on the sharp rock. Her ordeal, it seemed, had only changed its form. Samuel walked slowly down the incline, his movements deliberate, non-threatening. He kept the rifle pointed at the sky, a universal sign of peace he hoped she would understand. As he got closer, he could see the severity of her injuries. Her face was pale beneath its sun-darkened tone, her lips cracked and bloodless. A deep gash on her arm oozed blood, and her leg, that was bad. The bone had clearly broken through the skin before receding, and the swelling was immense. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. She said nothing. Her eyes tracked his every move, ancient and wary. She didn't understand his words, but she understood his presence, and it was a threat until proven otherwise. He stopped about 10 feet from her, close enough to see the exhaustion warring with the fire in her gaze. "You'll die out here," he stated, a plain fact with no pity attached. "Infection will take that leg before the coyotes come back." Spirit Fawn pushed herself up straighter, a movement that cost her dearly. A sharp gasp of pain escaped her lips, but she bit it back, her jaw tight. She would not show this stranger her weakness. She spat out a string of words in the Apache tongue, her voice surprisingly strong, the syllables like sharp stones. It was a curse and a warning. "Leave me to my fate, Ghostface. My spirit is not for you to take." Samuel didn't understand the words, but he understood the fury. He let out a sigh, running a hand over his tired face. What in God's name was he doing? He had a good mind to leave her the rifle and a canteen and walk away, but he knew he wouldn't. That flicker of humanity, the one he thought had been extinguished 5 years ago, was burning stubbornly now. He couldn't leave her, because leaving her would be to agree with the verdict of the world, that some people were simply meant to be thrown away. He knelt, setting his rifle on the ground beside him. He unslung his canteen and held it out. "Water," he said, keeping his voice low and even. Her eyes darted from the canteen to his face, searching for the trick, the trap. Thirst was a screaming demon in her throat, but her pride was stronger. He saw the hesitation. With a sigh, he uncapped it and drank from it himself, then held it out again. "It's just water." Slowly, cautiously, her eyes never leaving his, she reached out a trembling hand. Her fingers brushed against his as she took the canteen. She drank, not with the desperation he expected, but with a controlled, measured thirst, her dignity intact, even at the edge of death. When she was done, she held it out for him to take back, a silent, grudging transaction. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the clouds in hues of orange and purple. The air was already growing cooler. He knew he had to make a decision. "My cabin is not far," he said, speaking as much to himself as to her. "You can't walk. I'm going to have to carry you." He stood up and took a step toward her. Instantly she recoiled, dragging herself back against the rock, the sharp stone in her hand raised and ready. The fire was back in her eyes, blazing brighter than ever. Samuel stopped. He raised his hands, palms open. This was a fragile, dangerous dance. Two wounded animals from different worlds, bound by a shared sentence of isolation. He was a man who had forgotten how to trust, and she was a woman who had every reason not to. But the wilderness was patient, and its sentence was absolute. As the first star appeared in the darkening sky, Samuel knew they had only one choice, to forge a truce or to be consumed alone by the vast, unforgiving silence. The standoff held for a long, tense moment, suspended between the deepening twilight and the rising moon. The air grew cold, carrying with it the scent of dust and juniper. Samuel knew that words were useless. She didn't trust his language, and he didn't know hers. Trust, if it was to be built at all, would have to be forged from actions. He took a slow, deliberate step backward, away from her, and placed his rifle and canteen on the ground. Then he unbuckled his gun belt, the heavy Colt and its cartridge loops, and laid it carefully beside the rifle. He stood before her unarmed, his hands held open at his sides. It was the only truth he could offer her. He was choosing vulnerability. Spirit Fawn watched this ritual with an unblinking intensity. The removal of the gun, the iron that speaks with fire, was a gesture she understood. It was not a guarantee of safety, but it was a crack in the wall of her certainty that he meant her harm. Her own people had left her armed with nothing but their judgment. This stranger, this enemy, was disarming himself. The pain in her leg was a throbbing, relentless fire, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. The choice was simple and stark: die here clinging to her hatred, or live for a little while longer by placing a sliver of faith in a man who had no reason to show her kindness. When Samuel took another slow step forward, she did not raise the stone. Her hand remained poised, but the killing intent had faded from her eyes, replaced by a weary, watchful resignation. He knelt before her, his movements gentle. "I have to touch you now," he said, his voice a low rumble. "To lift you." He pointed to her, then to his own shoulders, then made a walking motion with his fingers through the air toward the direction of his cabin. She gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the permission he would get. Lifting her was a delicate and agonizing process. A sharp cry of pain was torn from her as he shifted her weight, the broken bone in her leg grinding with a sickening finality. She clenched her jaw, her nails digging into his flannel shirt, but she did not fight him. He was surprisingly gentle for a man of his size, his hands sure and strong as he cradled her against his chest. As he stood, the world swam in her vision, and she finally surrendered to the blackness that had been clawing at the edges of her sight. Carrying her through the treacherous, darkening landscape was one of the hardest things Samuel had ever done. She was light, yet she was a dead weight in her unconsciousness, and he had to navigate the rocky terrain while trying not to jostle her injured leg. He left his gun belt behind, taking only his rifle. He could come back for the rest later. The priority was getting her to shelter. Under the cold silver light of the moon, he was a solitary figure moving through a world of shadows, carrying a burden that was far more than just the weight of a wounded woman. He was carrying the first real human connection he'd had in 5 years. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was a dark shape against the pines. He nudged the door open with his shoulder and carried her inside. The single room smelled of pine, old smoke, and loneliness. He laid her gently on his own cot, the only soft surface in the place, and her head lolled to the side on the straw-stuffed pillow. For a moment, in the dim light from the open door, she looked not like a fierce Apache warrior, but like a broken doll, fragile and lost. He lit a kerosene lamp, the yellow glow pushing back the shadows and revealing the Spartan interior of his self-imposed prison. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with one chair, shelves holding a few tins of beans, flour, and coffee. He moved with a quiet efficiency, stoking the embers in the fireplace and adding fresh wood until a small fire crackled to life, bringing a welcome warmth to the room. He put a kettle of water on to boil, his mind racing. He had set animal bones, but never a person's. When Spirit Fawn awoke, it was to the gentle warmth of the fire and the low, unfamiliar sound of a man humming a tuneless, melancholy song. She was lying on a soft bed, a rough wool blanket covering her. The white man was at the table, tearing strips from a clean white shirt. Her eyes darted around the small space, taking in the strange angles of the wooden walls, the glint of metal tools, the alien order of it all. It was a cage, but it was a warm one. Samuel saw that she was awake. He stopped humming and met her gaze across the room. "Your leg," he said, pointing. "It needs to be set. It's going to hurt." He held up 2 straight, smooth pieces of wood for a splint and the strips of cloth. She understood immediately. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her pain. She had seen what happened when a break like hers was left to heal crooked. A life of lameness, of being a burden. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her heart pounding. She looked at the man, then at the fire, and then at the makeshift medical supplies on the table. She gave another one of her short, sharp nods. What followed was a trial of fire and will. He gave her a thick piece of leather to bite down on, which she took without hesitation. With a quiet apology he knew she wouldn't understand, he took hold of her leg. The world narrowed to that single point of contact, his strong hands, her broken bone. She screamed into the leather, her body arching off the cot as he pulled with a sickening, grinding pop. Tears streamed from her eyes, silent and hot, but she did not pull away. She endured. Samuel worked quickly, his face a mask of concentration, sweat beading on his brow. He aligned the bone as best he could, packed it with a poultice of herbs he used for his own injuries, and then bound it tightly with the splints and cloth strips. When it was done, they were both shaking, drenched in sweat and utterly exhausted. He gently wiped the tears and sweat from her face with a damp cloth. It was an intimacy that startled them both. Her dark, pain-filled eyes stared up at him, and for the first time there was something other than suspicion in them. There was a flicker of grudging respect. He had inflicted terrible pain, but he had also offered a chance at healing. The days that followed fell into a slow, quiet rhythm, a routine built on gestures and necessity. He would hunt and cook, leaving a plate of food and a cup of water by her cot. She would eat, her appetite slowly returning. The silence between them was vast, but no longer hostile. It was a shared space of healing. One afternoon she pointed to the gash on her arm, which was red and angry-looking. Then she pointed out the cabin window to a specific, dusty-looking green plant growing near the rocks. Samuel, skeptical but willing to try anything, fetched it for her. She crushed the leaves between 2 stones to make a paste and gestured for him to apply it. Within 2 days the redness was gone, and the wound had begun to close cleanly. He looked at her with new eyes after that. She wasn't just a victim he had rescued. She possessed a deep, ancient knowledge of the land that he, for all his years in the mountains, could only scratch the surface of. She was a survivor in her own right. They began to learn from each other. He would point to objects and say the English word. Cup, fire, blanket. She would listen, her expression impassive, and then repeat the word in her own tongue. Iuda, ko, nsa. A fragile bridge of language was being built, one word at a time. He learned her name was Spirit Fawn when he gestured to himself and said, Samuel, then pointed to her questioningly. She was quiet for a long moment, then spoke her name softly, as if reclaiming it from the people who had cast it away. He saw the story of her banishment in the haunted look that sometimes came into her eyes when she stared into the fire. He didn't need to know the details. He saw the echo of his own exile in her gaze. He was a man accused of being a thief. She was a woman accused of being a curse. Both sentences were a kind of death. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after he had brought her to the cabin, he was returning from checking a line of snares, a pair of rabbits slung over his shoulder. Spirit Fawn was sitting up on the cot, her splintered leg resting on a stool, mending a tear in his shirt with a needle and thread he had left on the table. The domesticity of the scene struck him with a force that almost buckled his knees. For the first time in 5 years, the cabin felt less like a hideout and more like a home. As he approached the clearing, his gaze swept the horizon out of habit, and then he saw them. 3 riders, far down the valley, their figures small but distinct in the clear afternoon air. They were moving steadily in his direction. A cold dread, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the day he was accused, washed over him. He knew the way the lead man sat his horse, the arrogant tilt of his hat. It was Frank, the man who had ruined him, and he was riding straight for the only sanctuary Samuel had left in the world. Folks, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Write your city and state in the comments below so I can send a shout-out. A single glance was all it took. Samuel didn't need to see the banner of a powerful rancher. He knew Frank's posture, the insolent slump in the saddle that bespoke a man who believed the world was his for the taking. The blood in Samuel's veins turned to ice. For 5 years, he had been a phantom, a whisper in the mountains. Now his past was riding toward him on a dust cloud, and it was about to kick his door in. He moved with a sudden, urgent economy. He burst back into the cabin, his face a grim mask. "Get down," he ordered, his voice a low, hard command. "Stay away from the window. Don't make a sound." Spirit Fawn's eyes widened, not with fear, but with an immediate animal understanding of danger. She had seen the change in him, the transformation from quiet companion to cornered wolf. Without a word, she slid from the cot to the floor, pulling the rough blanket with her, and pressing herself against the interior wall, her back to the fireplace. Her hand instinctively found the handle of the small skinning knife he kept on the hearth for whittling. Samuel grabbed his rifle from its pegs by the door and checked the load. He moved to the single window, peering through a small gap in the deerskin covering. The three riders were closer now, ambling up the path as if they owned it. Frank was in the lead, a portly man whose expensive clothes couldn't hide the soft cruelty in his face. The two men with him, Joseph and Charles, were the kind of hard-faced thugs that money could easily buy, loyal only to the man who signed their pay. "Samuel, I know you're in there," Frank's voice boomed across the clearing, thick with false bonhomie. "Don't be shy now. A man gets lonely in these hills. Thought I'd pay a neighborly call." Samuel remained silent, his rifle held steady. Let him sweat. The last time Frank had paid a neighborly call, Samuel had ended up an outcast with a reputation in tatters. "Playing quiet, are we?" Frank chuckled, a sound with no warmth in it. He and his men dismounted, their spurs jingling with an obscene cheerfulness in the tense silence. "Still holding a grudge, Samuel? A man's got to move on. I'm looking for some stray cattle, and I hear tell there's a good vein of gold somewhere up in these rocks. Wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" The lie was as plain as the pistol on Frank's hip. He wasn't looking for cattle. He was prospecting, and he wanted Samuel's land, his claim, and anything of value on it. And he was here to see if the ghost of Samuel was still a threat, or just a broken man ready to be swept aside. Samuel finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the closed door. "You're on my claim, Frank. State your business and be on your way. Now, is that any way to treat an old acquaintance?" Frank stepped onto the small porch, his boots thudding heavily on the wood. "I just want to talk." He reached for the door handle. "Don't." Samuel's voice was flat, cold, and deadly serious. The click of the rifle's hammer being cocked was loud enough to be heard outside. Frank's hand froze. A flicker of anger crossed his face. He wasn't used to being denied. He took a step back. "Fine. Be that way." He turned to his men. "Joseph, Charles, take a look around, see if you can spot any of my strays." It was the pretext he needed. The two men began to prowl around the cabin. Samuel tracked their movements, a grim feeling coiling in his stomach. He'd been meticulous, but a man couldn't live without leaving signs. His eyes fell on the splints on Spirit Fawn's leg. They were made from his own ripped shirt. Too clean, too new. It was Charles who found the sign. Near the stream where Samuel fetched his water, a single small moccasin print was visible in a patch of damp earth, partially obscured but unmistakable. "Hey, boss!" Charles called out, a triumphant sneer in his voice. "Don't see any cattle, but it looks like your neighbor has found himself some company." Frank's eyes lit up with a malicious glee. This was better than he could have hoped for. This was leverage. "What's that you say, Charles?" "Indian tracks. A woman's by the size of 'em," Charles said, walking back toward the porch. "You keeping a squaw in there, Samuel? The army doesn't take kindly to folks harboring renegades." The accusation hung in the air, potent and poisonous. Samuel's jaw tightened. "I'm warning you, Frank. Ride out now." "Or what?" Frank laughed, emboldened. "You'll shoot us? For what? Trying to uphold the law? We all know what those savages are like. Thieving, murdering. You're a fool, Samuel. First you get run out of town for being a thief, now you're shacking up with one of them. It fits." He took a confident step toward the door. "Now we're coming in. We just want to make sure the young lady is comfortable." The door splintered under Joseph's heavy boot, crashing inward. Samuel was ready, his rifle leveled not at Frank but at the larger threat of his henchmen. Before he could fire, however, a new sound cut through the tension, a high, piercing whistle followed by the solid thump of an arrow embedding itself in the doorframe, inches from Joseph's head. Everyone froze. From the dense shadows of the pine trees at the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged. He was an Apache warrior, tall and leanly muscled. His face was streaked with black and red paint, a declaration of war and vengeance. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, were fixed on the cabin. It was Wire. He held a bow in one hand and a war axe in the other. He had tracked Spirit Fawn for 2 weeks, his pride a burning coal in his chest, and his patience had finally run out. Frank and his men stared, momentarily stunned by this new development. "Well, I'll be," Frank breathed, a slow predatory smile spreading across his face. "Looks like the party's just getting started." Wire ignored the white men completely. They were insects, an annoyance. His gaze passed over them and locked onto the figure of Spirit Fawn, who had risen to her knees behind Samuel. He barked out a command in his own language, his voice sharp with authority. "Come, woman, you will face the judgment of your people." Spirit Fawn flinched as if struck. His voice was the sound of her betrayal, the voice that had condemned her. Samuel didn't understand the words, but he felt the venom in them. He shifted his stance slightly. placing himself more fully between Spirit Fawn and the warrior. Wyer's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to Samuel for the first time. He saw the white man's protective stance, and his fury grew. He spat another string of words at Spirit Fawn. "You shame us by hiding behind this white eye. Your spirit is already tainted. I have come to cleanse it." He took a menacing step forward, raising his axe. This was the moment, the turning point. Spirit Fawn looked from Wyer, the embodiment of the cruel past that had rejected her, to Samuel, the quiet stranger who had shown her a gruff, unexpected kindness. Her world had cast her out. His world had cast him out. In this small, besieged cabin, they were their own tribe. Slowly, painfully, she used the wall to pull herself to her feet, balancing on her good leg. Her face was pale with effort and resolve. Wyer watched her, a triumphant smirk touching his lips. He thought she was coming to him. Frank watched too, amused by the savage drama unfolding before him, but Spirit Fawn did not move toward Wyer. Instead, she hobbled the few steps to Samuel's side. She picked up the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, its weight a comfort in her hand. She stood beside him, her shoulder almost touching his, and faced Wyer. She didn't need to speak. Her action was her declaration of war, her final, irrevocable choice. She was with the outcast Cowboy. Wyer's face contorted in a mask of pure rage. The rejection, public and undeniable, was more than his pride could bear. He let out a furious war cry and charged. At the exact same instant, Frank gave his order. "Get 'em both! The gold is in there!" Chaos erupted. Wyer leaped toward the porch, his axe raised high. Samuel fired his rifle, not at Wyer, but at the ground in front of him, the blast of gunpowder and splintering wood making the warrior check his charge. As Wyer hesitated, Joseph and Charles rushed the cabin from the side. "The window!" Spirit Fawn cried out, her first English word in a moment of crisis. Samuel spun, swinging the heavy stock of his rifle and catching Charles in the chest as he tried to climb through the window frame, sending him sprawling back outside. Joseph was already through the broken door, a long knife in his hand. Before Samuel could turn, Spirit Fawn swung the iron poker with all her strength, catching Joseph's arm with a sickening crack of bone. The man howled in pain, his knife clattering to the floor. Outside, Wyer and Frank's men had found a common, temporary enemy. Wyer saw them as obstacles, and they saw him as a savage to be put down. But their true targets were inside. Samuel slammed what was left of the door shut and dropped the heavy crossbar into place. He dragged a heavy table to block it, just as the full weight of the men outside crashed against it. An axe blade splintered the wood. They were trapped. The echoes of Samuel's past and Spirit Fawn's betrayal were no longer ghosts. They were outside, armed and furious, and they were trying to tear their way in. In the dim light of the cabin, surrounded by the sounds of splintering wood and shouted threats, Samuel and Spirit Fawn stood back to back, a two-person clan against the world, their fight for survival just beginning. The assault on the cabin was a symphony of brutal percussion, the rhythmic thud of an axe against the door, the crash of a rock against the window shutter, the furious shouts of men drunk on the promise of violence and gold. Inside, the chaos was met with a deadly calm. Samuel and Spirit Fawn moved not as two people, but as a single four-armed entity of survival. The small space was no longer a prison, it was a fortress, and they were its sole defenders. "The chimney," Spirit Fawn said, her voice low and steady amidst the din. She pointed a slender finger upward. "Smoke," Samuel understood instantly. While Frank's men and Wyer focused their rage on the obvious entry points, they were ignoring the one they couldn't see. He grabbed a handful of pitch-heavy pine knots from the kindling box, along with some damp leaves he'd gathered to smoke jerky. As another blow shuttered the door, he tossed the bundle into the heart of the fire. The effect was immediate and dramatic. A thick, acrid black smoke billowed up the stone chimney, pouring out of the top like a foul genie released from a bottle. Outside, the clear mountain air was suddenly choked with a blinding, suffocating cloud. Curses turned to coughs. The relentless chopping stopped. "What in blazes is that?" Frank bellowed, his voice ragged. "He's trying to smoke us out." Charles gagged, stumbling back from the cabin. This was the moment Samuel was waiting for. He moved to the small shuttered window at the back of the cabin, the one overlooking the steep drop-off toward the creek. He unlatched it quietly, peering through a crack. Wyer, less concerned with the smoke and more with his singular obsession, was using the confusion to creep along the side of the cabin, his war axe held ready. He was separated from the others, his focus entirely on finding a way in. Samuel didn't aim to kill, he aimed to cripple. He sighted down the barrel of his rifle, held his breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The bullet screamed through the smoke and tore through the flesh of Wya's thigh. The warrior cried out, a sound of shock and agony, and collapsed, his axe clattering on the rocks. His charge was over. Spirit Fawn was already moving. With Joseph still nursing his broken arm and Charles disoriented by the smoke, Frank was the primary threat at the door. "Now!" Samuel yelled, reloading with practiced speed. Spirit Fawn grabbed the heavy iron kettle of boiling water from the hearth. Bracing herself on her good leg, she hobbled to the splintered door just as Frank, in a fit of impatient fury, shouldered his man Joseph aside and took up the axe himself. "Incompetent fools! I'll do it myself!" he roared, as his axe blade bit deep into the wood one last time, creating a jagged hole. Spirit Fawn swung the kettle. A scalding torrent of water shot through the opening, splashing directly onto Frank's face and chest. He screamed, a high, unmanly shriek of pure agony, dropping the axe and clawing at his blistering skin. The arrogant rancher who had built an empire on lies was undone by a simple pot of water. The fight was broken. Charles, seeing his boss incapacitated and hearing the warrior's cries, lost his nerve. He dragged the whimpering Frank away from the cabin and half-carried him toward the horses. Joseph, clutching his broken arm, scrambled after them. They were thugs, not soldiers, and their courage had dissolved with their leader's authority. Silence fell, broken only by Wya's labored breathing and the low moans of Frank as his men secured him to his saddle. Samuel kicked the bar from the door and stepped out, rifle at the ready. The three white men were already in a panicked retreat, disappearing down the path as quickly as they had arrived. Their shadows fled, leaving only the wreckage of their attack. Samuel turned his attention to Wya. The warrior was trying to drag himself to his feet, his face a mask of hatred and pain. His leg was useless. Spirit Fawn came to the doorway, leaning against the frame, the empty kettle still in her hand. She looked at the man who had condemned her, no longer with fear but with a cold, clear pity. She spoke, and for the first time, her voice carried the full weight of her spirit, not in his language but in hers, so he would understand the depth of her judgment. "You are not a warrior, Wya. You are a bitter child. You did not banish me. You banished your own honor. My spirit was never yours to judge." She stood taller, her chin held high. "I am not returning. My path is here now. Go. Tell them that Spirit Fawn found a new tribe." "A tribe of two." Wya stared at her, his rage finally extinguished by the sheer force of her will. He had been defeated not by the white man's bullet, but by her words. The power he held over her was an illusion, and it was now shattered. Without another sound, he began the slow, agonizing crawl toward the forest, dragging his wounded leg and his broken pride with him. He would live, but his authority among his people was gone forever. The sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows across the clearing. The air was clearing, carrying the scent of pine and spent gunpowder. Samuel and Spirit Fawn stood in the quiet aftermath, the silence between them now filled not with uncertainty, but with the profound understanding of a battle shared and won. He walked over to her, his blue eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" She nodded, a small smile touching her lips for the first time. "My arm is sore from the kettle," she admitted, her English slow but clear, "but my heart is strong." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. It was a gesture of immense tenderness from a man who had forgotten the language of touch. "You were brave," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "We were brave," she corrected him softly, her dark eyes holding his. They worked together to clean the wreckage. They repaired the door as best they could, swept up the splinters and tended to their minor wounds. The cabin, which had been a place of siege, once again became a sanctuary. That night, they sat before the fire, the space between them smaller than it had ever been. The ghosts of their pasts had come for them, and they had faced them down together. The false accusations of thief and curse no longer had power here. In this small wooden box in the heart of the mountains, they were simply Samuel and Spirit Fawn. "Frank, he will not be back," Samuel said, staring into the flames. "His pride is as burned as his face. The truth of what he is was shown today." He finally felt the weight of the 5-year-old lie lift from his shoulders. He had not cleared his name to the world, but he had cleared it to himself. "Wya will tell the story of a woman who would not break," Spirit Fawn added. That is enough. She had not been rescued. She had chosen her own destiny. Samuel looked at her, at the strength and grace that had endured so much. The affection he had felt growing in his chest had blossomed into something deeper, something more powerful. It was a love forged in the fires of adversity, as strong and true as the mountain itself. "This is your home now, Spirit Fawn," he said quietly, "if you want it." She looked around the small, simple room, at the cot where she had healed, the hearth where she had fought, the man who had seen her not as a savage or an outcast, but as an equal. She reached out and placed her hand over his. "A home is not the wood or the stone," she said, her gaze unwavering. "It is the people who defend it." She moved closer, her shoulder resting against his. "My home is here." Samuel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her into a gentle embrace. The lonely silence of the mountains was gone, replaced by the steady, comforting sound of two hearts beating as one. They were no longer outcasts rejected by their worlds. They were the architects of a new one, a world built on a foundation of courage and respect, its borders defined by the love they had found in the heart of desolation. A new dawn was breaking, just for them. True belonging isn't found in the societies that cast us out, but is built with the courage to defend one another. Love and respect can forge the strongest tribe, even from two lonely outcasts. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.